What a shitty wife you are. I told you not to call me at work unless it's important.
For a moment, my breath stopped at the sound of my husband, John's, voice yelling annoyingly on the other end of the phone. John is currently away on a business trip that involves staying overnight. Being busy in sales, John had repeatedly told me not to interfere with this very important work. So, I wouldn't keep contacting him unless it was something significant. It was his first voice that I kept calling and finally connected. Without even listening, he assumes it's nothing important, and I feel so angry I could explode. It's important. Actually, Susan has.
Shut up. If my mom needs to talk to me, she'll contact me directly. The fact you're calling means it's nothing important. It's trivial. I'm hanging up now. This is why women are so...
John loudly interrupted my words and hung up the phone while grumbling complaints. Unknowingly, I exhaled the breath I had been holding. Yet, my heart was still not at peace. Clutching my smartphone, I took several deep breaths until I finally managed to calm down a bit. I stared at the message screen for a while, then gently closed my eyes. Doesn't he know the saying, dead men tell no tales? A message from my brother-in-law, Bob, undoubtedly informed me of my mother-in-law, Susan's, death. My name is Emma. I'm a 32-year-old freelance web designer. After struggling at a company in my 20s, I finally became independent, and now I work from home while living with my husband. My husband's name is John. We met through a client I was working with. We got along well, and without any dissatisfaction, we moved from dating to marriage. John was calm and kind while we were dating, but his attitude cooled off drastically once we were married. Trying to have a conversation, I would only get indifferent responses.
I'm tired.
He would either ignore me while vaguely watching TV or make sarcastic remarks on his bad days.
You can work lazily from home. When I'm at work, I have to humor my boss and customers, no matter how much I hate it. You're so lucky. Since you have it easy, you could at least make a delicious meal.
True, working from home means I can avoid interpersonal conflicts and work quietly, but it's not stable since I only get paid per project. The constant anxiety and pressure are intense. The atmosphere between us grew increasingly tense. I was feeling anxious about our future life. At one point, we even tried to have a child. Hoping that becoming a father might make John a bit more gentle, and wanting to finish childbirth before getting much older, we hoped for a child. But that dream never came true. I did get pregnant once. We were delighted at the time, but a few weeks later I had a miscarriage. I can't forget the pain of that time. The guilt of not being able to bear our baby. Though still a fetus, the irreplaceable loss of our child's life was an indescribable sadness. At the time, I couldn't concentrate on work and spent days crying, cooped up at home.
The baby must have felt so uncomfortable in your womb and thought it better to die.
Far from showing concern, John looked down on me lying in bed and adopted a blaming attitude.
We have to start over again. That's annoying. Wait, can you even get pregnant again?
Hurt by such insensitive words, my heart was increasingly shattered. The one who saved me from rock bottom was my mother-in-law, Susan. Ever since our marriage, I had a good relationship with Susan, who would come over to the house or exchange messages with me. We would share recipes and makeup tips, maintaining a friendship-like relationship with a bit of care. When Susan learned about my miscarriage, she grieved as if it were her own loss and supported me. There was a time when John hurled abuse in her presence.
What a defective product. Can't even properly bear a child.
That time, she exploded, grabbed him by the collar, and lectured him.
John, what are you saying? Sit down over there. Blaming your wife for a miscarriage is unbelievable. Emma is not at fault at all. It's just a whim of God that it happened. To think I raised a son with such a twisted personality and way of speaking.
Worn down by John's attitude, I felt a sudden sense of relief. Additionally, my heart overflowed with gratitude and love for Susan, who had stood up for me. In John's absence, Susan confided that she too had experienced a miscarriage. That was before she got pregnant with John.
There was indeed a baby here, but I couldn't give birth. I was so sad and frustrated. I blamed myself. Back then, medical science wasn't as advanced, and the causes were unclear. They even suggested it might have been my fault. I was severely blamed by my mother-in-law. I really wanted to tell you, it's not your fault.
Susan's words as she held my hand were painful, and I felt a tight squeeze in my chest.
I often thought about dying with the baby I couldn't give birth to.
Susan, you suffered so much. When I blurted that out, Susan smiled gently.
You're okay, I'm here now, and afterwards, I had John and 2 more. So, it's going to be okay. You'll likely be able to have the next baby, but I know it's tough right now. You can vent to me. Even just a little chat might help you feel better. My husband passed away a few years ago, and I have plenty of time now. Whenever you need, just call me.
Hearing such warm and loving words, my eyes began to well up with tears. Before I knew it, I was clinging to Susan, tears streaming down my face. After that incident, my relationship with Susan deepened, bonding us like true family, perhaps even stronger. However, John's behavior remained the same. Even as I recovered and managed to resume my usual work and household duties, his indifferent attitude continued. No abusive words were exchanged, but neither were there any pleasant conversations. John would come home, throw his jacket on the sofa, and say,
I'm tired. Isn't dinner ready?
Then, after finishing his meal, he'd leave his dishes scattered without cleaning up, telling me,
I've got a business dinner with a client the day after tomorrow, so prepare some kind of gift.
He treated me as if I were a servant, mostly ignoring me as if I were heir. I wondered if there was any meaning to this cold marriage, but on the other hand, my relationship with Susan continued, including messaging and meeting a few times a month for tea or shopping. Because of my good relationship with Susan, I was scared of getting a divorce and possibly losing that connection. Furthermore, John started bringing less money home. Despite being in sales, he only provided the bare minimum for living expenses.
You're making money too, right? This should be enough to live on.
He decided one way, with no chance of discussion. Even his attitude seems to be that he would rather put money in, so I shouldn't complain. No sign that his belongings or clothes have suddenly become flashy. There was no suspicion of an affair, such as lipstick on his shirt or the smell of a woman's perfume. Just excuses about work becoming busier, tougher clients, and more business trips and overnights. I wondered why, if he treated me like air and didn't want to be home that much, he didn't just ask for a divorce. Months passed as I got used to a frugal lifestyle, working hard at home and my job. My work began to be recognized more than before, and I received more projects and higher rates from clients who had helped me previously. As work got busier, it increasingly got on track. So my earnings increased, and if I could keep my job at the current pace, I might be able to afford to save even if John's living expenses were small. One day, it happened. "Are you on another business trip? You were just on one last week." I was surprised to hear that John, who had just taken a business trip a few days ago, was leaving again in 2 nights and 3 days. It seemed excessively frequent. If it were due to sales, business trips could happen, but I hadn't heard anything about him switching departments since we got married. The sudden, significant change in routine felt unnatural.
That's what I said. I have troublesome client who call me to the local area every time. Unlike you clicks around on the internet. I earn my keep on the ground.
John snapped this at me and threw an empty suitcase in front of me, saying, "Get it ready if you understand." Why must I endure this? That thought crushed my heart, and I just silently looked down at the suitcase. Without paying any attention to me, John finished his meal and shower and went to sleep. As I approached the bed, John was snoring loudly, showing no signs of waking up. His smartphone was right in front of me. Using John's finger for the fingerprint authentication, I could easily peek inside. But if I found definitive evidence, it would surely lead to divorce. Then I would have to explain everything to Susan. If we divorced, I couldn't imagine maintaining the same relationship with her as before. However, maybe Susan would scold him, saying that's my son's fault, and we could continue our relationship not just as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but as friends. As I was about to use John's finger to unlock his phone, the screen suddenly lit up. The notification for the messaging app displayed prominently, showing a name that was clearly a woman's.
Looking forward to our weekend getaway. Since last week was shopping, let's relax and cuddle at the resort hotel this time.
Strangely, I felt no anger. Rather, I was almost happy to have evidence to demand compensation from John and this woman. Taking advantage of the moment while he was deeply asleep from drinking, I unlocked John's smartphone and launched the messaging app. I quickly took a photo of the screen with my phone and slowly scrolled through it. I took photos of all of their messages from when they would have started a relationship. There were also photos taken on the bed, naked, and I struggled to keep my hands from trembling. I then checked whether John's overnights were really for business trips or for meeting this woman. It turned out not all were lies. Occasionally, he really was on business trips. Even after all this, John showed no signs of waking up, and gathering evidence was chillingly easy. Collecting all this evidence was chillingly easy, as if he hadn't intended to hide his affair at all, which made my head spin. The next morning, John acted as if nothing was amiss. He sat down as usual, waited for breakfast, complained about the seasoning, belittled my work, and whined about how hard his own life was. Watching him leave the house, my heart remained strangely calm. I even had the peace of mind to think about searching for a lawyer. Perhaps because I had stopped talking, John seemed to be in a slightly better mood. When the weekend arrived, John unusually said I'm off, and left for his trip, which was not just a business trip but an affair getaway. As I was deciding whether to go out for groceries after tidying up the house, an unexpected call came through on my smartphone. John has a brother and a sister. The caller was John's younger brother, Bob. I heard that Bob, who was married, was living with his parents to save money for a house.
Hello.
As I answered the phone, I heard a voice much more somber than when I had last seen him.
Hi, Emma. I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but my mom suddenly passed away this morning.
Oh, no. It must be a mistake, I exclaimed, almost screaming. Images of Susan, with whom I had spent so much time, flashed through my mind. Her smile when we had tea together. Her serious face when she gave me advice. And her warm expression when she supported me through my miscarriage. The sudden news of her passing pierced my heart like a knife.
It's true. She collapsed suddenly this morning, and we called an ambulance, but she was gone by the time they arrived. And is John there? I can reach him.
Hesitating for a moment, I felt a surge of desire to spill everything to Bob. But now was not the time. It wasn't the right thing to tell him now. I'm sorry, he's not here. He's on a business trip. I think it's stuff for you. Shall I talk to him?
Thank you. That would be great. Honestly, I'm overwhelmed with things to do and can't manage to make calls.
After expressing my condolences again to Bob and telling him I would help if needed, I ended the call. Then I immediately tried to contact John. With Susan gone and the pain in my heart throbbing, I grew anxious as John didn't answer his phone. After ringing more than 10 times, John finally answered, his voice clearly irritable.
Hello?
I finally got through to you. Actually, it's about Susan. As I tried to speak, John cut me off with this remark.
What about Mom? I told you I'm on a business trip. Don't call me with trivial stuff.
For a moment, I was breathless. He was irritated, receiving a call from his wife in the middle of his affair trip. Knowing this made my head burn with anger. Come home right now. This morning, Susan.
Shut up.
Determined to convey my message despite his annoyance, I spoke firmly, which seemed to really bother him as he yelled to cut me off.
If it was really important, Mom would have contacted me directly. If not, it means it's nothing serious. I'm working. Don't call me.
With that, John ranted in a harsh tone and abruptly hung up the phone. I stood shocked and confused, my hand trembling as I held the smartphone. He hadn't even listened. It was about his mother. I tried calling several more times, but it didn't connect, and finally, a message indicated that the phone was either off or out of signal range. It was hopeless. I took a deep breath. If he didn't want to talk to me that badly, I'd comply with his wish not to call. He had said it himself, so he had no right to complain later. Then I left a note in the dining table that read, "I am going to your parents' house," quickly packed my things, and left the house. By the time I arrived at my in-laws' house, it was already evening. In the midst of all the hustle, Bob and his sister Sarah greeted me. There was a list of family tasks left on the living room table, with many papers scattered around.
I'm sorry. There's still so much to do with all the calls I need to make. I haven't gotten around to tidying up yet.
No, I'm sorry for coming alone at such a time.
It's okay. But what about John? Is he coming later?
Bob, expecting that we would arrive together, furrowed his brows in confusion seeing me alone. Sarah also looked puzzled, checking outside to see if John's car was there, making me feel apologetic. Resolutely, I relayed the phone conversation I had with John a few hours earlier. After a painfully long silence, Sarah was the first to speak.
No kidding. Unbelievable. What is he thinking?
Trying to contain her anger, Sarah clenched her fists, trembling, and her face turned red.
That idiot. Damn, should I contact him right now?
Bob muttered in a terribly low voice. Looking closely at the notes Bob was fiddling with, I saw the funeral home's name and the number of people to call written down. Next to the word chief mourner, eldest son was written, and John's name was beside it. Noticing my gaze, Bob quickly let go of the note.
I'm sorry, the funeral home told me that normally the eldest son does it, so I told them he would. I'll contact the funeral home now.
Yes, we have to notify them as soon as we know. Bob immediately called the funeral home to change the chief mourner to himself. That night, they allowed me to stay over. The next morning, Bob was busy with submitting the death certificate. I spent the day contacting relatives who hadn't been reached the day before about Susan's passing and devoted myself to preparing for the funeral. Many of Susan's friends and acquaintances came to express their condolences that day. Every time someone asked about John's absence, I explained he was on an important business trip that he couldn't miss. Some were astonished, others angry, and a few even tried to contact John on the spot. However, John either had his phone off or didn't respond to anyone's calls. After an overwhelming night, I collapsed into sleep the next day. The funeral began, and somehow I managed to bid farewell to Susan. However, during our last goodbye, I couldn't hold back my tears at the sight of Susan's serene face. Unashamedly, I cried loudly, embracing Sarah as we mourned Susan's departure.
It's rare for a mother-in-law to be so loved by her daughter-in-law. I'm sure Mom was happy to have gotten along so well with you, Emma.
Bob said, comforting me. The three of us returned to the family home and shared memories of Susan, shedding tears together. There was still no contact from John. From the next day, we dealt with the funeral expenses and entertained Susan's friends who visited the family home, spending frantic days. About 3 days later, the front door of the family home was violently thrown open. Heavy footsteps stormed in, and John burst into the living room.
How long are you going to squat at someone else's house? You've neglected everything at home. What have you been doing?
As soon as he saw me, John yelled, and then he raised his eyebrows, noticing Bob and Sarah with me. He seemed to calm down for a moment, looking around, puzzled by the overly tidy living room filled with extra chairs.
What's going on? We have guests, and where's Mom? I'm thirsty.
At his words, Sarah quietly stood up. But before she could speak, Bob rushed up to John and punched him right in the face. John screamed and fell backward with a loud noise. Bob then straddled him, grabbing his shirt.
Mom is dead. Her funeral are all over, and you show up now.
The image of Bob, usually quiet and polite, was instantly flipped. His face red, spitting in anger, he yelled at John, who, forgetting the pain in his cheek, looked dumbfounded. Eventually, as the words began to sink in, John screamed back, red with anger just like Bob.
I didn't hear anything about this. Why didn't you tell me something this important?
We did contact you. Susan, Sarah, and I, even relatives called you like crazy.
John choked on his words, looking away. I don't know when John turned his smartphone back on, but the number of missed calls regarding Susan's death would easily exceed 50. It must have been difficult for him to pretend he was unaware. Yet, unwilling to admit his fault, John glared at me.
It's your fault for not getting to the point quickly. If you had told me properly about Mom, I would have come right back.
You didn't even try to listen, did you?
Sarah's cold voice drowned out John's yelling. In stark contrast to the still trembling Bob, Sarah glared at John without hiding her disdain.
You guys, did you ever consider Susan might be lying?
That's impossible, because, you see, I recorded that call. Want to listen to it? As I showed my smartphone to John, his eyes widened. Indeed, I had set my phone to automatically record all calls. Unlike meetings on a computer, calls on my smartphone often involve minor corrections or additions, and it's easy to get into he said, she said arguments later. This feature is useful when dealing with assertive salespeople or remembering who called, and I cherished it. Of course, my calls with John were recorded, and I had already played them for Bob and Sarah. As John stared, Sarah glared back.
And by the way, John, you're lying. I checked at your company. There's no business trip. It seems like you've been taking paid leave.
What? You checked up on me at work?
Yes, that right. Sarah, who works at the same company, had her suspicions and had inquired about John's department.
Well, I was worried. You were supposedly too busy even to come to your mother's funeral. Or is there something you'd be troubled by if we looked into it?
Bob, who had been silent until now, looked up, his face pale, and stared at John with a grave expression.
So, what have you been doing after taking leave?
Unabashed, John loudly insisted.
What do you mean what? I'm working. There are entertainment duties I had to attend to on my leave. You wouldn't understand.
As John continued shouting, I turned on my smartphone. It was packed with evidence of John's cheating that I had gathered before. They trip with his affair partner, right? I said that and showed the smartphone to Bob and Sarah.
Hey, what are you talking about? Stop saying ridiculous things.
Ignoring John, who was yelling in panic, I showed them the images of the messages between John and his girlfriend and the receipt from a brand shop where he must have bought a gift for her. Among them was a photo of the two with their arms around each other. Anyone could understand the situation by seeing this. Of course, I could also show the messages they exchanged right before this trip.
What's this? Unbelievable. To think he left his mom like this for an affair trip with this woman. He's out of his mind. And these messages, they're so sappy. It's disgusting.
Sarah immediately showed her disgust. Bob turned pale and looked at John, unable to fully grasp the situation.
It's not just the trip, but this is betrayal to Emma. And spending so much on gifts for her, it's too much damage to the family budget.
For Bob, who is currently working hard to save money, the financial issues are pressing. John hardly contributed money to the house and lavished it on his mistress, which was unforgivable for him.
Wait a minute. What are you looking at?
and enraged, John snatched the smartphone from us. He then looked through it and advanced on me as if he was about to grab me.
When did you see this? You snooped on my conversation with her.
Bob managed to restrain John's hand as he roughly grabbed my clothes, after which John, in frustration, threw my smartphone violently on the floor. A loud thud painfully echoed through the tense room. I didn't want to do this either, but you were obviously suspicious, always away on business trips and hardly ever at home. Most of the money you earned never made it home. You had nothing but unkind words for me. I definitely thought something was up. I picked up the smartphone while retorting defiantly. Then I just happened to see a message from your mistress. Various other evidence also easily came out from the bedroom. You were so bad at hiding it. I was disgusted. That's when John lost it.
Shut the hell up. Having a wife and a family, working hard and earning at work. Women naturally flock to you. In the world of men, that's part of what counts. Or do you prefer a husband who never rises in the ranks?
I bowed my head upon hearing this, not because I was hurt, but because he was so shamelessly justifying himself. It made me laugh. I managed to regain a serious expression, took a deep breath, and then shouted back at John, "You can say that after you start taking care of your family. You have no right to talk about being a provider. Don't ever come back to our house." Eventually, John was disowned by Bob and Sarah shortly thereafter. Treating his spouse poorly and running off to an affair without any remorse, not to mention his insensitive behavior regarding his mother's passing, was enough reason for them to no longer consider him family. I cleared out all of John's belongings from our house and started living comfortably alone. And of course, I dealt properly with the affair by consulting a lawyer for compensation. Not just from John, but also from his mistress. Turns out, the mistress was a woman from a company John had business with, and Sarah was able to identify her quickly after seeing the evidence photos I had collected.
I'm sick of him. That woman is just as bad. Got to rethink associating with her.
Sarah said as she shared the woman's information she found on social media with me. After the compensation claim was finalized, I sent a certified letter to both John and his mistress. Then, a while later, John started bombarding my phone with calls.
Come on, cut me some slack. Kicked out by my family, I had to rent a cheap apartment. How am I supposed to live like this? The compensation is ridiculous. You snooped around me, didn't you? It's not like I'm the only one to blame.
Complaining, still clueless about his wrongdoing, I was dumbfounded and eventually blocked his number. Then, a few days later, he started showing up at my house. Thinking who it could be, I opened the door and there was John, looking much dirtier than before. "What are you doing here? I told you never to come back." As I pushed him away, he flashed an unpleasant grin.
Got it. I won't enter the house, but at least do something about the money. The compensation is too high, and I barely make ends meet. Can't even afford a new suit. It's a big problem for a top salesperson like me, right?
Shamelessly begging for money like that. Why don't you ask the girlfriend you traveled with for support, not me? When I made a sarcastic remark, John clenched his lips in frustration and frowned.
It's because you sent a compensation claim to her too. Why did my wife find out? She was furious that she had to pay compensation too, and decided to break up with me.
So it seems that John was dumped because his girlfriend, who saw him as a cash cow, turned into a liability. It seems he lavished her with expensive brands and took her on luxurious trips frequently. Turns out, she was just a lousy woman who only saw John for his money. Oh, right. But you, unlike me, you're a respectable person who excels in a company setting, earning praise at work, right? Then take care of yourself. Goodbye. With that, I slammed the front door shut. I quickly contacted my lawyer, and soon a restraining order was issued against John. John really squandered the money he earned on his mistress and frivolous things, and he dumped all the household responsibilities on me, so he had no life skills. It seems he's living a miserable life in his apartment now, unable to do any housework. His dirty appearance when he showed up at my house was the result of his lack of life skills. With no domestic skills and subsisting on junk food every day because he couldn't cook, he couldn't work, and a few months later, it seems he was fired from his job. I heard this from Sarah, who works at the same company. It's unlikely John will find a good job again, and his attempts at finding a full-time job have failed. However, he needs to sort out his life and pay the compensation. A few months later, Sarah told me she saw John doing a traffic control part-time job, looking unwell on a road she traveled on a business trip. After all his condescending and selfish behavior, John ended up continuing in a low-wage job with no freedom. And the mistress ended up not being able to pay the compensation herself, so her parents had to cover it for her. Her parents were furious about her extravagant affair with a married man, and she had to pay them back. She was banned from enjoying shopping and trips she used to indulge in, and had to take a job under strict parental supervision that she didn't want. She's forced to lead a suffocating life with no freedom, either at work or in her private life, and continues to work while dealing with stress every day. After that, I combined the savings I had accumulated with the compensation money and moved to a new apartment early. The current apartment also holds memories of the time I spent with John, and just living there brings back unpleasant memories. I wanted to get away from such a place as soon as possible. Work projects keep increasing, and I'm managing to build a good track record while earning the trust of several clients. I devote myself to work and love alone. I turned over a new leaf and started a new life. A few months later, I met a man at a cafe in my new town and started dating. He works in planning and development at a major company and has a great interest and respect for my job as a web designer. I was drawn to his calm nature and logical, cool demeanor. Surely, he would never blatantly cheat or shamelessly betray his family. A few years later, I married him and we were blessed with a child. And this time, there was no problem, and the baby in my womb is growing healthily. My new husband is very caring during my pregnancy, and that has been a big help. Now, as a couple, we look forward to the birth of our child while we continue working and preparing. A kind husband and another family member about to be born? A peaceful, loving home awaits me,